Hello everyone! The topic of this video is elements in the periodic table. And the purpose of this video or this topic is to look at a periodic table and different ways that it's organized. So the first thing when we look at the periodic table is that we're going to see chemical symbols. And those chemical symbols are going to be 1 to 2 letters long, and they are abbreviations for the element's name. Now, it's important when we're writing chemical symbols that we do not capitalize that second or third letter. So only the first letter in a chemical symbol is capitalized. And as a quick example, if we take cobalt, which is C lowercase o, that is one element. If we were to accidentally capitalize that second letter, it now becomes 2 separate elements. The capital C would represent carbon and the capital O would represent oxygen. And now we would have a compound of carbon monoxide. So it's very important that when we're looking at a single element that we only capitalize that first letter. All right, so this first periodic table that we're going to look at, we are going to focus in on the columns and the rows. So if you look across the top of the periodic table, you're going to see blue numbers going from 1 to 18. And if you see atop the number 1, the word group. So your vertical columns are called groups in the periodic table. And there are 2 types of numbering schemes that we're going to need to know for the groups. The first one is shown on the periodic table, where you go from 1 to 18, starting from left to right. Now, the second type of numbering scheme is going to involve using A's and B's. So the first column doesn't change much. It's still a 1, but we're going to call it 1A. And then the second column would be 2A. But for this type of numbering scheme, we're going to skip everything in the center, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. And then pick back up at column 13, where we would call that 3A. And you go across until you get to 8A at the very end. So the first 2 columns and the last 6 are very important. That's what we call our main group elements. And those are labeled with your A's. The B columns we're not going to focus on as much. You don't need to know the numbering scheme for the B's. Those are what we call our transition metals, and they are important, and we will talk about transition metals in this class, but we don't need to know the numbering scheme for those with the B's. Okay, and then as we go down, so if we look at the rows in the periodic table, those are our purple numbers, and if you notice, the rows are called periods. So a row is a period and a column is a group. And the periods, those only have one numbering scheme. They go from top to bottom, 1 down to 7. Now you do have 2 bottom rows here. If you notice, those do not have numbers because those are squeezed in to rows 6 and 7. It's just that if we were to put those in rows 6 and 7, you would get a very long table that's hard to put on a sheet of paper. And so we tend to bring those down to the bottom, but they are technically rows 6 and 7. All right, now the other important thing to look at here on this periodic table is the color code. So if you notice down at the bottom right, we have a color code of metal, metalloid, and non-metal. And you also see the difference between the solids, liquids, and gases. Again, for the purposes of this class, you do not need to know the solids, liquids, and gases. But the metalloids are in pink, and those are going to be a ladder that separate the metals from the nonmetals. Okay, now I will not test you on whether or not an element is a metalloid, but I will test you on whether an element is a metal or a nonmetal. So most periodic tables are going to show that ladder of metalloids in some way. And then to the left of that ladder, majority of your elements in yellow are going to be metals. So the metals are located on the bottom left of that metalloid ladder. And then above it, if you notice, the boxes become green. Those are your nonmetals. Okay, so nonmetals are going to be in the top right. Again, the top right of that metalloid ladder. So I'm not as interested in whether you can tell a metalloid from a nonmetal, but I am interested that you can see the separation on either side of that ladder. And then if we look at an individual box, so down here at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that the top number, which is an integer, it's going to be a single number. That's your atomic number, and we will talk about that later on in the class. The symbol, the chemical symbol that we've already talked about, is the letter scheme in the box. And then the atomic mass, again, we're going to talk about atomic mass and atomic number later on in the class. And then some periodic tables will include the name of that element. If it's not included, then you can simply type into Google the chemical symbol, and it should bring up the name of the chemical or the name of the element. All right, so most of this we have talked about. If you're looking for the two different numbering schemes for those groups, you'll find that at the bottom of this slide. So again, the first two columns and the last 6 columns, those are our main group elements. And those can be subdivided even further into alkali metals and alkaline earth metals, which are the first 2 columns on the left. And then the last 2 columns on the right, you have noble gases is at the very end, and then halogens right before it. And then that lower section, the B section of the periodic table that we ignored, those are your transition metals. And the unique rows that were at the bottom that were squeezed into rows 6 and 7, those are your lanthanide metals and your actinide metals. So for the purposes of this class, you do need to recognize the transition metals. You do need to recognize what the main group elements are so that you can label those 1A to 8A. And I do want you to know the halogens and the noble gases, because I will use the term halogens quite a bit in this course and transition metals, and so you do want to know those. And the noble gases will also be important. All right, this is a simplified version of that metal versus non-metal chart. Again, here they're calling the metalloids semi-metals. That's okay, because again, you will not be tested on those. But on the top right-hand side of the semi-metals, that green section, that's going to be your non-metals. And then majority of your elements that are located on the bottom left are going to be your metals. There is one exception to all this that you do want to note, and that is hydrogen. So hydrogen is a nonmetal. Okay, even though it's located on the left of that ladder, it is an exception. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's go through some practice here. So they're either going to give us the name, the elemental symbol, group period, or metal versus non-metal, and we need to be able to fill in the rest of this chart. So we're going to look at this one row at a time. So this first row is cesium. Okay, we need to locate cesium on the periodic table. And cesium is going to be in row 6 in the first column. Okay, so the abbreviation there is CS. And that's a capital C, lowercase s. And because it was in the first column, if you notice, the groups that they're filling in here are 2A's and 7A's, so we do want to use that A scheme. So we don't want to just write 1, but 1A. And then the period, I believe, was the 6th period, right? So first column and 6th row down. And then whether it's a metal or a non-metal. Well, if it's in the first group and it's not hydrogen, which is our exception, then that's going to be on the left side of the periodic table, and we call that a metal. All right, and I will do one more with you. So the second one, this time they don't give us the name or the element symbol, but they do give us the location. So we're looking in group 2A, period 5. So group 2A is our second group, and period 5 is on the 5th row. So if we drop down in the second group on the 5th row, we're looking right here at strontium, SR. Okay, and again, that is on the left side of that ladder since it's only in the second group and it's not our exception, which is hydrogen, so it's still a metal. Okay, so pause the video, and if you haven't already, try the last 2 rows, and then the solutions should be in your PowerPoint slides. Okay, and that ends this section on the periodic table.